Welcome to Watchtower History.
We're back again. We found some more correspondence from Fisher and others that we highlighted and talked about in our previous discussion. The man who dared disfellowship, Judge Rutherford. And here we are back again doing a little addendum for it and to add a few things that unfortunately we missed in the original conversation. So, Jeff, what other new things can we do with this?
Well, since that discussion, I've come across some new information that I didn't have previously that shed some light on what was going on at the time. And also, we have some of that Fisher correspondence that we've teased in the past that we're actually going to go through some of that. If you remember, Fisher is one of the writers of the Finnish Mystery. He wrote the Ezekiel part of the book, and he, of course, is one of the men of that Watchtower bunch who ended up in prison because of the acts of sedition and things that Watchtower was doing at the time. If you haven't seen our discussion on the Faith in Action film, please do so, because that gives a lot of detail as to what was going on there, and also our rude person discussion as well. So in Fisher's earlier career, he was a writer, and he wrote a series of weekly articles for the Scranton Republican, which was the paper in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where he lived. And you could see some of those articles here that you can find today in the newspaper. And it was called Mr. Fisher's Weekly Letter. And you could see the advertisement for it there on the left. And it says some of Sunday's features. It says right there, Mr. Fisher's Weekly Letters. One of Scranton's thinkers and writers' thoughtful comments, various topics, splendid Sunday reading. Some of the titles are interesting. Was it a Sodom and Gomorrah? Lessons of experience, calamities men make. Calamities show God's attributes. He had an article here, The Man Without a Country. There was a Zionist conference at Cologne. Modest ambitions, unexpectedly satisfactory realizations. And they, of course, were still looking for the return of Israel as an evidence of a prophetic fulfillment at that time.
Not invisibly.
Yeah, literally. That we'll find in our discussion on the third trumpet and the fourth trumpet, where they start replacing Israel with, hey, it's all about us kind of thing. That, if you haven't seen those discussions, very, very interesting, but there's more to come on that. Stay tuned. Another article here, The Brain Age. Progress of the Last Century, Evolution's Explanation. Really a forward march in God's plan. And notice they say plan here, that it was premeditated. What it became later for Watchtower was a purpose, a divine purpose. God has a plan A, but it didn't fall through, so he had to devise a plan B. So his purpose was to make the earth a home for mankind, but he didn't plan it. He didn't think it through.
Good point for this article to get that across.
Here's another one. Scrap It. Out to the scrap heap, world's greatest scrapper, scrap pile of the universe. So some interesting, catchy titles just to catch your attention. What is this about? You know, it makes you want to take a look at it. Polluted water supplies. Importance of pure water. How water becomes contaminated. And then, of course, he puts a biblical spin on it. The water of truth. This one on the right here is interesting for me. Modern prison methods. Correction and reformation.
Well, Jeff, it shouldn't be, because back then, you have to remember how the United States was founded. It came from England, and those countries in Europe, France, they were not noted for having decent prisons. And the people that escaped that said, hey, we're not going to do this again to people. What our relatives, what we've seen people go through. Even if you take it a step further, keep prison correct just for people who have different point of view. Because if you had a different point of view than King Louis, your life was miserable in prison. So there was a big in the United States. That's why our prison system to this day on the founding of this nation is so lenient.
But Fisher was going to go a little bit further than that, because if you look at what he's saying, it says correction and reformation, futility of cruel methods, and God's prison methods. So what he's talking about is our prison system here in America and in most of the world is based on punitive
Mhm.
justice. You do the duty, you're going to pay the reward, the consequences for what you've done. But what he's saying is that God's perspective is that these people should be reformed. That's God's prison method. And so that it was a less judgmental type of thing. It wasn't retributive justice. It was reformative justice. Make the person better by through their prison experience, not just punish.
In other words, restitution.
That's what they're pointing at. That kind of thing, restitution. That's that scripture in Acts chapter 3, the restitution of all things. That's kind of how they were applying it. But what Watchtower did with it under Rutherford's regime was that they became more punitive again, more judgmental, especially with that sheep and goats article, which we're going to touch on a little bit. Watchtower became more judgmental. It was a more judgmental, judging kind of approach that Jehovah was meant to punish and judge instead of reform
Yeah.
and
So in other words, you're not only not allowed to live forever, you're destroyed.
basically, yeah. And that's
Yeah.
where Watchtower was going.
Yeah, the reward was, and the restitution was live for, to destroyed. If you don't follow, you're destroyed. Once again, back to punitive.
Yeah, and so you could see the difference in thinking between the two men, between Russell's theology and that of Rutherford's. Where Watchtower went became a much more judgmental and critical type of mentality. That started in the 1920s with where Rutherford's going. We're getting there again. Stay tuned. So here's another article, Under Fire. Power acquired, mud to Moses. And it's good to be under fire. So, what is that about? The headline is very catchy, tries to give you just enough to tease you and pull you in to try and read it. This middle one's interesting. The Sleeping Sickness. A chance to earn $38,000 prize. Remarkable sleepers, and then he tries to bring in a scriptural perspective, spiritual drowsiness. And the last one on the right, what's it like to be dead? Curious conceptions of death, influence of evil spirits, some things the Creator tells us. And finally, if you had 20 millions, oppressive atmosphere of money, functions of wealth, and discontent coming from that. So that's interesting. And then there's two others here. One is about the threatened coal strike. There's three sides of the question: the causes of the situation and what would the outcome be. And the final one, the drama and the church. When the clergy were playwrights and actors, the drama of Hebrew history. So very catchy titles, really catches your eye. I don't know if this is just something the newspaper asked him to do or if this was paid advertising space that they were using. I don't know if Fisher could have afforded this himself, but he did have a friend in the area, and the Sieberts. Now, Gertrude Siebert, we talked about a little bit in the birthday discussion. But her family, her husband was rich, and they were able to help fund a few things within Watchtower itself. So it's possible that's the origin of the money to help with this. And we see Clayton Woodworth, who also lived in Scranton, Pennsylvania, very close to Fisher here. He also had some articles in the paper as well in that same time period.
And if people were interested, they might have just let them write for free.
Yeah.
We won't pay you, but you can write and we'll print it. So we don't know.
I find the titles interesting, something to really provoke your interest and pull you into reading it. So, if you remember, in the April 1st, 1924 Watchtower, there's a little blurb in there that's titled Brother Fisher Temporarily Resigns. And he was one of the editors at the time of Watchtower, if you recall. It says, to the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and the editorial committee of the Watchtower. Dear brethren in Christ, For more than a year, my physical condition has been such that I could not reside in Bethel and perform my full duty of devoting my time wholly to the service required there. Understanding that it is the rule that the members of the editorial committee should devote all their time to the Lord's service, and being unable to measure up to that rule because of conditions over which I have no control, I therefore respectfully ask that my name be dropped from the editorial committee for the time being, with the hope that if at some time in the future conditions change, I may be reinstated as a member of that committee. I assure you, one and all, that I love you dearly as brethren in Christ, and you have my very best wishes and prayers, and I ask that your prayers be offered on my behalf. When we discussed this previously, we discussed this pamphlet, Bruder George Fisher. And in this document, it adds a little more light to this statement that's in the Watchtower. There's a personal letter that we discussed in our previous discussions on this, where Fisher comments on that little blurb in the Watchtower. And he says, if my experience had showed me that Brother Rutherford was sincere and truthful, I would, of course, answered him more broadly. But he is not sincere and not truthful. For there's no use in answering his letter, as he would twist my letter as much as he did when he published my letter in a twisted manner in the Watchtower. I want to keep my mouth shut with a muzzle while the outlaw is in front of me. There was something going on between the two men, and what Fisher wrote, Fisher stating, is not what appeared in the Watchtower. It was changed and twisted by Rutherford. In the meantime, since we've had this discussion, and remember some of the things that Fisher's accusing Rutherford of. Basically, there were a couple men in there that at Bethel in Watchtower at headquarters that were involved with other women, and they wanted to get remarried. So they went and asked the Pope. They asked Rutherford if they could get a divorce, and we saw evidence of that in the census data, in the census record for the individuals. You can see the spouse's name changes right at the time that this letter is written. So it verifies and gives evidence for what's being claimed here.
Again, I just can't seem to wrap my mind around that they would actually go to Rutherford for such a request. I mean, it's just, I even though we talked about it before, as we're reminded and bringing it back up again, it is. It's like the kings going to the Pope and saying, "May I get a divorce and to absolve this marriage?" And they gave him that power to do it.
Or they allowed it, right?
How did I mean? I just can't understand how people would put themselves in that situation. If I was going to divorce my wife, I wouldn't ask anyone for permission, except her, of course. But it shows how the society was changing, and the mindset and the mentality that would have never happened with the prior president. I can't see somebody going, "Oh, Pastor Russell, I don't like my wife anymore. I want to get a younger, more beautiful." He would have read them the scripture from back in the Old Testament where God hates a divorce, the one that they apparently misapply now. But he would.
I want a newer model, is what.
Yeah, and he would have just reasoned with them along those lines. What made them go to him knowing he wasn't going to reason this out with them?
Where there's this discussion because Fisher's having, you can see in the discussion where the Bible students of the time are telling them that this is not the right thing to do, and they want to do it anyway, so they just go to Rutherford and ask for permission. So it's a bizarre behavior, but there's another...
A little off topic, but sorry about that. But
No, that's good. That's good. But there's also the other statement in here as well that was very interesting that we discussed, and that was the alleged visit to the burlesque by Rutherford and some others that had been witnessed by 2 or 3 witnesses. And it is for that reason. And that was just days before the memorial that year. And so it was for that reason that this church trial was to be brought up on these charges. And if the charges were true, they would have disfellowshipped Rutherford. They never disfellowshipped him, of course. If you remember, Fisher had a bad heart condition and he died before it happened. There was no murder. There was no nothing suspicious. Just the timing of it was interesting. So since then, we've come across some new information. If you remember, after Fisher died, Rutherford took it upon himself and of course other writers in the Golden Age to publicly accuse Fisher after he was dead as to what was going on. So in the May 4th, 1927 Golden Age, again it says, hey, the charge in Fisher's letter is grossly false and libelous. He is dead, as you know. I have it from Judge Rutherford's own lips. He never saw L. Jolson in his life and doesn't know what he looks like.
But he's too busy accused of going to see Al Jolson.
The accusation wasn't going to see Al Jolson.
So how did that even get in there?
That's a really good question.
I mean, the subject was totally breached.
Yeah.
He was brought on charges of going to see something indecent with women. And here they say he never saw Al Jolson. Well, again, he didn't go see Al Jolson. And as you said earlier, when these letters were written, there were more than one witness. There were two or more witnesses. He followed the protocol. And, you know, without being there, one of them's lying.
And do you really want to write about somebody like this after they've died?
Mm-hmm.
They can no longer defend themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody knew who L. Jolson was, especially if he lived in New York.
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather please you.
All the Broadway shows, L. Jolson. The first talking motion picture, The Jazz Singer, was started with L. Jolson's voice. He was the main character in the movie. I think that was 1927, just shortly after this. Jolson was a very famous guy, especially for those who lived in New York. Why after he was dead? A dead man can't defend himself.
Yeah, and divert the attention from what the actual subject was.
Yeah.
Now they're not thinking about what the accusation was. They're thinking about where the finger is being pointed at.
And why make public accusations like that? That's very strange. There were other things going on with Rutherford, of course, and it seems like he's putting it out there, trying to defend himself. And of course, a lot of these accusations and things led to his reinterpretation of Romans chapter 13 and what the higher powers or the higher authorities were, and stating that he and the elders and the others were the higher authorities. And so therefore they couldn't bring, unless they had 2 or 3 witnesses, they couldn't bring an accusation against an elder. That was changed literally because of the things Rutherford had been accused of at the time. See our 2 witnesses discussion for more on that. And also the other evidence that we have that Rutherford had something in it for Fisher, even after he died, was that when he published that final edition of The Finished Mystery, and he replaces Revelation 12 with his New Nation article, and that's a future discussion for another time, but he removes the entire Ezekiel portion of the book and just publishes the Revelation part. Why? Because Fisher was the author of that. And Rutherford was soon to write Vindication in 1930, 31, 32, in those early years, in the early 30s. That was going to be his reinterpretation of Ezekiel and how the whole book of Ezekiel applied to Watchtower after 1918 and 1919. Well, Rutherford was the one leading in the lead of Watchtower in those years. So basically, the entire book of Ezekiel is all about Rutherford. Rutherford's basically saying, I'm the chosen one, it's all about me. And we've seen that subject many times, and we've discussed that many times on this particular channel. Every so often, I'm gifted with some items from various collectors, and I never know exactly what I have. But I get boxes of things, and so I start leafing through the boxes, and I start looking at it, and I saw there's a document entitled The Will and Testament of Charles Taze Russell. And on the back is a short letter from Fisher, our man who dared disfellowship Rutherford. And the author of this document says, instead of any member of the editorial committee being impeached and dismissed from the committee because of being found to be unworthy the position by reason of either doctrinal or moral laches, it seems that the only member on the committee from April 1919 to March 1924 who had enough love for the truth which he had received to wish to defend it was asked to resign. It states he was asked to resign.
Now, who wrote this document? And where
This is
was it published?
So this is R.H. Bricker, and it was published in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And this would be after
Distributed to the
Fisher
college
died.
students.
Yeah, this would be after Fisher died. Remember, Rutherford in his document states that trouble started with him and Fisher somewhere in the summer of 1922. What happened in the summer of 1922 that you remember, Paul?
The conventions and the trumpet blasts, the new light.
Yeah, which particular convention?
The Cedar Point would be
That's the famous one, yeah.
the famous one.
And we've discussed that one in our first trumpet blast discussion. So if you haven't seen that one, we have a 3-parter on that. That was interesting. So here's what Fisher says. This is what happened.